It was a cold December night when everything started to go wrong, the kind of night that makes the world feel still, as if time itself slows down, and the snow falls quietly, covering everything in a blanket of white. Inside, a family was gathered, enjoying the warmth of their home after a long day of Christmas celebrations. The Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its lights twinkling softly. The smell of freshly baked cookies still lingered in the air. The father, mother, and their 2 children sat together, the joy of the evening still in their hearts, as they exchanged stories and laughter. They had just finished their Christmas dinner and opened their presents. Everything seemed perfect, just like a Christmas should be. But that peace was shattered when they heard the knock. It came at the door, and it was odd because it wasn't the friendly knock they expected. It was persistent, like someone was waiting on the other side, urging them to answer. At first, the father thought it might be someone delivering more gifts or maybe a late visitor who had lost track of time. But when he opened the door, there was no one there. Just an empty, quiet street covered in snow, with the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. It didn't make sense. The family's home was in a quiet neighborhood. People didn't knock on doors this late at night. Confused but not entirely alarmed, the father stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. But as he turned around, his eyes fell on something strange, something that shouldn't have been there. A small wooden box sat right in the middle of the front step. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. There were no markings on the box, no name, no address, nothing to indicate who it belonged to or where it had come from. The father, trying to make light of the situation, brought the box inside, thinking it might be a prank. After all, it was Christmas. People did weird things sometimes. But as soon as the box touched the kitchen table, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, just a sudden chill in the air, like the warmth had been sucked out of the room. The family didn't know it yet, but this box had already begun to change the atmosphere in their home. The mother, trying to shake off her unease, suggested they open it. Maybe it was a gift they hadn't expected. But as the father reached for the lid, something else happened. The lights in the kitchen flickered and the room grew even colder. The flickering was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down everyone's spine. The family stared at the box, unsure what to do. They could hear it now, the soft, almost imperceptible whispering. It was so faint, they thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, as though something unseen was moving through the house. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, as if they were alive. They tried to brush it off, dismissing it as their imaginations running wild. But deep down they knew something wasn't right. The Christmas cheer they had felt earlier had evaporated, replaced by a strange, growing tension. It was like the house had suddenly become aware, as if it had its own heartbeat, one that echoed through the walls. And then the whispers came again, clearer this time. Something was watching them, something was inside the box, and it wasn't going to let them forget. The family had no idea how much danger they were in, but they would soon find out. The next morning, the family woke up with a strange, uneasy feeling still lingering in the air. The house, once filled with the warmth and joy of Christmas, now felt cold and hollow. Despite the festive decorations still up, the cheer had faded overnight, replaced by an unsettling sense of foreboding. No one spoke about the box directly, but each family member had felt it. The presence that had entered the house when it had arrived. It was the father who first brought up the idea of opening the box. He had convinced himself it was just some odd prank, a gift left behind by a friend or neighbor who thought they'd enjoy the mystery. The strange occurrences from the night before, the sudden drop in temperature, the flickering lights, the whispers, still weighed heavily on him. But he tried to dismiss them. After all, it was just a box, right? The family gathered around the kitchen table. The box sat there in the same place where it had been left the night before, its presence impossible to ignore. It wasn't large, about the size of a shoebox, but there was something about it. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong in their home. The wood was rough and worn, as if it had been aged for centuries. There were no markings, no labels, nothing to explain where it had come from. It was simply there. With hesitation, the father reached for the lid. As soon as his fingers touched the edges, something happened. A sharp, cold gust of wind blew through the room, though the windows were shut tight. The house seemed to groan, as if it were waking up from a deep sleep. The temperature dropped even further, and the once cozy kitchen suddenly felt like a place trapped in a winter storm. Inside the box was a small, twisted figurine. It was carved from dark, aged wood, and though it was roughly made, there was something deeply unsettling about it. The figure seemed to be that of a person, but the features were exaggerated in a grotesque way. Its eyes, however, were the most unnerving part. They were wide open, staring out as if they were watching the family with an intensity that made their skin crawl. It was as though the eyes were alive, filled with some kind of intelligence, watching their every move. The mother, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, was the first to speak. "We shouldn't keep this," she said softly. "It doesn't feel right." But the father, feeling the weight of the strange events but unsure of what to do, ignored her. "It's just a figurine. A weird Christmas gift," he said, trying to reassure her. But as he lifted the figurine from the box, the air grew even colder. The whispering began again, faint at first, but slowly growing louder. It was as though the very walls of the house were speaking. The family exchanged nervous glances, trying to ignore the growing unease in their chests, but it was getting harder to pretend everything was fine. And then, just as the father set the figurine down on the table, it happened. The lights flickered and then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. The family froze. In the silence, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. Slow, heavy steps, like something or someone was walking in the attic. The family had checked the attic the night before. It was empty. There was no way anyone could have gotten up there. The father, his heart pounding in his chest, grabbed a flashlight and motioned for the others to stay close. They slowly made their way toward the stairs leading up to the attic, but the closer they got, the louder the footsteps became. It was as if something was pacing back and forth, waiting for them. Every step they took seemed to echo, and with each passing moment, the fear in their hearts grew. They knew they couldn't leave. They couldn't escape the house. It was as though it had trapped them, its cold, empty presence surrounding them. The attic door creaked open, and the darkness inside was suffocating. But when they stepped inside, they found nothing. The attic was as empty as it had been the night before. Yet the heavy feeling of something watching them remained, pressing in from all sides. The family quickly realized that whatever was haunting them wasn't going to leave. And that was when they understood they were not alone. Something had followed them home, and it wasn't going away. After the terrifying discovery in the attic, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer safe in their own home. The strange presence that had first been felt the night the box arrived had now become something tangible, something threatening. The whispers, which had been soft at first, now felt like they were inside their heads, constantly growing louder. It was as though the house itself was alive, and whatever was inside it wasn't just watching them, it was waiting. They tried to go about their day, but it was impossible to ignore the growing dread. The father, trying to remain calm for the sake of his family, attempted to brush it off as stress or some kind of collective imagination, but every corner of the house felt colder now, and the air had a heaviness to it, like it was pressing down on them. The children, once so full of Christmas excitement, now stayed huddled together, unable to sleep in their own rooms. They could feel the presence following them, creeping up the stairs, standing in the doorways when they least expected it. Even the family dog, who had been playful earlier in the night, now cowered in fear, its tail tucked between its legs as it stared at empty corners with wide, fearful eyes. It was that afternoon, just after lunch, when things took a sharp turn. The father, trying to put the disturbing thoughts out of his mind, went back to the kitchen to get a drink. As soon as he stepped inside, he noticed something strange. The box was back on the table. He could have sworn that they had left it in the living room, untouched. But now there it was, sitting in the middle of the kitchen, exactly where it had been the night before. It was as if it had moved on its own, without anyone touching it. The father's heart began to race again, the sense of unease quickly building into fear. With trembling hands, he opened the box again, but this time the figurine wasn't inside. In its place was a small piece of paper, old, yellowed, and brittle. He unfolded it carefully, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The paper was covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift on the page. They weren't words, they were something darker, something ancient, and as he stared at them, the temperature in the room plummeted even further, a freezing cold that made his breath visible in the air. Before he could say anything, a loud, guttural sound echoed through the house. It came from somewhere deep within the walls. A growling, like an animal trapped inside, clawing at the foundation, trying to escape. The growling was followed by loud thuds, as though something was moving from room to room with tremendous force. Panicked, the father rushed to the living room, calling out to his family, but the moment he entered he froze. There, standing in the center of the room, was the figure from the box, the twisted, wooden figure. Its eyes glowed, flickering in the dim light, as if they were burning with some unholy fire. The thing was no longer just a decoration, it was alive, and it was staring directly at him. The figure's mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, the wooden features twisting and contorting in a way that no human face could ever do. The whispers that had been haunting the family grew louder, now filling the entire house, echoing from every corner, from every shadow. They called to him, urged him to come closer, to let the figure take control. The family tried to move, but it was as though their bodies refused to obey. Every step they took felt heavier than the last, and the closer they got to the figure, the more the house seemed to shift around them. The walls seemed to close in, the very air thick with terror. And then, with a sudden force, the figure lunged forward. But it didn't just move physically, it seemed to reach into their minds, pulling at their thoughts, twisting their fears. In that instant, the family realized they were no longer just trapped in the house, they were trapped in something far worse. They had invited something in, something ancient and powerful, and now there was no escape. The house had become its prison, and they were its next victims. The terror in the house was palpable, thick, and suffocating. The family was no longer in control. Whatever force they had unleashed with the arrival of the box and the figurine was now fully in charge. The once cozy home had turned into a twisted labyrinth of dread, each room darker and colder than the last. The whispers were relentless, an almost constant hum in the background, now indistinguishable from the thoughts in their own minds. But the worst part was the presence they could feel, something watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The family had to do something. The father, desperate to protect his loved ones, had the sinking realization that they were trapped, that the house was no longer theirs. The figure from the box, that grotesque wooden thing, had grown stronger, more powerful with every passing moment. They were no longer just dealing with an object. They were up against something far older and far more dangerous than anything they could understand. It was as if they had unwittingly invited a dark force into their lives, a force that had now taken over their home. The mother, shaken but determined, recalled something she had heard from her grandmother, a woman who had always been deeply superstitious. Her grandmother had spoken of ways to trap spirits, of ancient rituals that could keep dark entities at bay. The family had to act quickly. Time was running out, and it seemed like the malevolent force in the house was growing stronger by the minute. The ritual was simple but dangerous. It involved creating a protective circle using fire, salt, and mirrors. The salt would act as a barrier, the fire as a cleansing force, and the mirrors would reflect the entity's power back at it. The family needed to gather these items and prepare the circle before the figure could strike again. But as they began to set everything up, they could feel the air getting heavier, the temperature dropping further, as though the house itself was rejecting their efforts. The father, still holding onto the last shred of hope, grabbed the salt from the kitchen and sprinkled it carefully on the floor in a large circle. The mother lit the candles, their flames flickering weakly as if struggling against the oppressive cold. The children watched in fear, unsure of what was happening but knowing that they had no choice but to follow their parents' instructions. As they set up the circle, the figure appeared once more, standing at the far end of the room, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It was watching, waiting, as though it knew exactly what they were trying to do. The wooden figure seemed to pulse with life, its twisted form stretching unnaturally, becoming even larger than before. The air around it crackled with dark energy, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. And then the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The family could hear their own names being spoken, each voice more frantic and insistent than the last. They were trying to break through, to reach their minds, to twist them into submission. The figure's grin widened impossibly, and the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on them. But the family refused to back down. With the circle finally set, the father reached into the heart of the ritual and threw the salt and fire into the air. The flames ignited, dancing across the room, and the salt exploded with a force that sent a shockwave through the house. The figure screamed, a sound that made the family's blood run cold. The mirrors shattered as the light from the fire reflected back, throwing the house into chaos. For a split second, everything went dark. The whispers stopped. The presence was gone. When the family regained their senses, they found themselves lying on the floor, the house eerily quiet. The temperature was back to normal, and the cold that had gripped them was gone. The lights flickered back to life, and the house seemed to be peaceful again. The figurine, however, was gone. The family slowly rose to their feet, still in shock, unsure of what had just happened. Had it all been a nightmare? Or had they truly just escaped something evil, something that would have destroyed them? As they gathered together, relieved but shaken, they thought it was over. They thought they had won. But when they glanced toward the broken mirror, the reflection staring back at them wasn't their own. It was the figure, smiling. And that, my friend, was the moment they realized, whatever it was, it hadn't left. It had only bided its time. Even though the family thought they had won, thought they had defeated whatever evil force had taken over their home, they were wrong. The peace that followed the ritual was deceiving. It was as though the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The air was still, unnervingly so, and though everything seemed calm on the surface, deep down they all knew it wasn't over. The first night after the ritual, the family tried to go to bed, their minds still reeling from the events. They kept glancing at the broken mirror, afraid of what might be waiting there. The thought of that grotesque wooden figure, its eyes, its smile, lingered in their minds like a dark cloud. But as they drifted into uneasy sleep, nothing happened. The house seemed normal again, almost too normal. But it was the following evening when everything changed. It was late, and the family had gathered in the living room, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. The father had turned on the TV, but no one was really watching. The tension in the room was thick, each of them too afraid to speak of what had happened. They had tried to move on, but the memory of the figure's smile, its mocking grin, refused to leave them. Suddenly, a noise interrupted their uneasy silence. A knock at the door. It was slow and deliberate, almost as if it was counting down the moments. The father stood up, his heart racing. He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door, trying to convince himself that it was just a neighbor or someone trying to share holiday cheer. But when he opened it, there was nothing. No one. Only the same empty, snow-covered street outside. No footsteps. No signs of anyone having been there. And yet, something was different. The air outside had a strange, unnerving weight to it. The world beyond the door felt wrong, as if it had shifted, become something foreign. When he stepped back inside, something in the living room caught his eye. The figure, it was back. It wasn't just the wooden figurine now. No, it had somehow grown larger, more powerful, more menacing. The thing stood in the center of the room, its twisted wooden form towering above them, its eyes burning with an intensity that made the family freeze in place. The smile it wore was wider, more grotesque, its mouth stretching impossibly across its face. And this time there was something new about it. There was a presence in the room now, more than just the figure. It was as if every shadow, every creaking floorboard was alive. The house had become a living thing, its walls shifting, its floors groaning with every movement. The family could feel it in their bones. The house was feeding off the fear, growing stronger with every moment they spent in it. Panic set in. The mother tried to grab the children and run, but the house seemed to warp around them, trapping them in place. The walls stretched, the ceilings closed in, and the windows became blackened, as if they were sealed off from the world outside. The family couldn't escape. They were caught in the grip of whatever dark force had taken over their home. The figure began to move. It twisted and warped, its wooden limbs cracking with every shift. The family could hear the whispers again, but this time they were no longer faint. The voices were clear, disturbingly so. They called to them, urged them to join, to surrender to the darkness. The father, heart pounding, made one last desperate attempt. He grabbed the nearest candle and thrust it toward the figure, as though the light could somehow drive the darkness away. But the figure only laughed, its voice low and hollow, as though the very walls of the house were mocking them. And then, with a force that shattered the silence, the house itself seemed to collapse inward. The air grew thick, choking the family, and everything went black. When the darkness lifted, there was no trace of the family, no sign of the house. Nothing remained but the wooden figure, now standing in the center of the empty space. The whispers had stopped, and the grin on the figure's face grew wider than ever. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the house waited, ready for the next family to arrive. The cycle would begin again,